The music had barely faded when Vivian Cole stepped into the bridal suite and dropped a folded letter onto the white silk sheets. Elena Marsh was still in her wedding dress, her hands trembling as she reached for it, not yet understanding that her entire life was about to collapse in the space of a single breath. Damien stood by the window, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the paper his mother had just placed before his bride. He had not asked for proof. He had not asked for an explanation. He simply watched Elena unfold the letter and read words that were not her own, written in a hand that only resembled hers, describing a night with another man that had never happened. Elena felt the room tilt. She looked up at Damien, searching his face for the man who had held her hand through 2 years of courtship, who had whispered promises to her in quiet gardens and busy hallways alike. That man was gone. In his place stood someone cold, someone already convinced, someone who would not meet her eyes for longer than a heartbeat. "Tell me it isn't true," Damien said, though his voice carried no real request for an answer. It was a statement, dressed as a question, and Elena understood in that instant that nothing she said would matter. "It isn't true," she whispered anyway, because the truth was the only weapon she had left. "Damien, I have never touched this letter. I don't know who wrote it. Please, look at me." He did look at her, but his eyes had already made their judgment. Vivian stood behind him with her arms folded, her expression calm in a way that should have warned Elena more than the letter itself. There was no surprise on Vivian's face, no shock at the accusation she had just delivered. There was only quiet satisfaction, the look of a woman watching a plan unfold exactly as she had designed it. "Get her out of this house," Damien said, and the words landed like a blow. Elena's knees weakened, but she refused to fall. She would not give either of them the satisfaction of watching her break completely, not tonight, not with the staff already whispering outside the door, not with the wedding guests still finishing their champagne 2 floors below, unaware that the marriage they had just celebrated was already being erased. "Damien, please," Elena said, stepping toward him. "Whatever this is, whoever gave you this letter, it's a lie. I love you. I married you tonight because I love you." "Love doesn't lie," Damien said, and there was something almost desperate in the way he said it, as if he needed to believe his own words more than she needed to hear them. "Pack your things. You have 1 hour." Elena stood frozen for a long moment, staring at the man she had trusted completely, searching for any sign that he might reconsider, that he might ask one more question, that he might notice the letter was written in ink, too fresh, too careless, too convenient. But Damien had already turned away, already decided that his mother's word carried more weight than his wife's plea, and Elena understood that arguing further would only humiliate her more than she already had been. She changed out of her wedding dress in silence, her hands shaking so badly that she could barely manage the buttons at her back. Marisol, her closest friend since childhood, arrived within the hour, alerted by a single frantic message. She found Elena sitting on the edge of the bed, in a plain gray dress, staring at nothing, a small suitcase already packed beside her. "What happened?" Marisol asked, though the answer was written across Elena's face. "He believes I betrayed him," Elena said quietly. "His mother gave him a letter. I don't even know where it came from. I've never seen it before tonight." Marisol's expression darkened with anger on her friend's behalf, but there was no time for outrage, not yet. The hour Damien had given her was almost gone, and neither of them wanted to be present when it ran out. They left through the side entrance, avoiding the main hall where guests still lingered, unaware that the bride they had just watched exchange vows was leaving her own wedding in disgrace. Outside, the night air was sharp and cold against Elena's skin, a stark contrast to the warmth of the ballroom she had left behind. She climbed into Marisol's car without looking back at the Cole mansion, its windows glowing gold behind her, each light a reminder of the life she had believed was beginning, and was now ending, before it had truly started. "Where do you want to go?" Marisol asked gently, starting the engine. Elena did not answer right away. She was thinking of the past 2 years, of the quiet dinners, the long walks through the city, the way Damien used to laugh before the weight of his family's business settled permanently onto his shoulders. She had known his family disapproved of the match at first, though she had never understood exactly why, since her own family's wealth had been more than sufficient to satisfy any practical concern. She had believed, foolishly perhaps, that love had been enough to overcome whatever resistance existed. Now she understood, though only in fragments, that something larger had been at play from the very beginning, something that had nothing to do with love or loyalty, and everything to do with money and power. She thought of Vivian's calm expression, the absence of surprise, the ease with which she had produced the letter at precisely the right moment, on precisely the right night, when Damien's guard would be lowest and his instinct to protect his pride would be strongest. "Take me somewhere far from here," Elena finally said. "Somewhere no one will look for me." Marisol did not ask further questions. She simply drove, taking the long road out of the city, as the lights of the Cole estate disappeared behind them, swallowed by the darkness of the countryside. For the first hour, neither of them spoke. Elena stared out the window, watching the shapes of trees rush past in the dim moonlight, her mind replaying the scene in the bridal suite over and over, searching for some detail she might have missed, some moment where she could have said something different, done something different, stopped the collapse before it began. But there was nothing. The letter had been placed in front of her, like a verdict already decided, and no argument, however true, could have changed a mind that had already been made up long before she entered that room. "He didn't even ask where I was that night," Elena said eventually, breaking the silence. "The letter mentioned a date. I was with you that weekend, Marisol. We were at your sister's house in the mountains. He never even asked me where I was. He just believed it." Marisol's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Because he wanted to believe it," she said quietly. "Or someone wanted him to believe it badly enough that it didn't matter what the truth actually was." Elena said nothing, but the thought settled uncomfortably in her chest, a suspicion she was not yet ready to fully examine. If someone had wanted the marriage to end this quickly, this completely, there had to be a reason, and reasons like that rarely had anything to do with sentiment. They usually had everything to do with money. They stopped for the night at a small roadside inn, far enough from the city that no one would recognize either of them. Elena sat on the edge of the narrow bed in the small room, still wearing the plain gray dress, staring at her own hands as if they belonged to someone else. She did not cry, not yet. The shock was still too large, too heavy, pressing down on her chest and stealing the breath she needed to properly grieve what had just been taken from her. "You should rest," Marisol said softly, sitting beside her. "I keep thinking about the way he looked at me," Elena said, "like he had never known me at all. 2 years, Marisol. 2 years of dinners and conversations and promises, and none of it mattered the moment his mother handed him a piece of paper." "It will matter," Marisol said. "One day, it will matter to him, but you cannot wait for that day. You have to build something now, something that belongs only to you, something no one can take away with a single lie." Elena nodded slowly, though she was not yet certain what that something would look like. She only knew that the life she had planned, the life she had believed was beginning that very evening, no longer existed, and somewhere ahead of her, in a future she could not yet see clearly, she would have to construct a new one from nothing. She thought, briefly, of writing to Damien, of demanding one more conversation, one more chance to prove her innocence. But the memory of his face, closed and certain, told her that any letter she sent would likely go unread, tossed aside by whoever controlled his mail before it ever reached his hands. Vivian Cole was not a woman who left loose threads, and Elena suspected that even now, hours after the wedding had ended in disgrace, Vivian was already working to ensure that no version of the truth could ever reach her son. The following morning, Elena and Marisol continued south, away from the city, toward a small coastal town neither of them had ever visited before. It was Marisol's suggestion, a place far enough removed from Elena's old life that she could disappear into it completely, close enough to the sea that the constant sound of the waves might, in time, offer some small comfort. As they drove, Elena watched the landscape change from the manicured hills of the estate country to the wilder, more open terrain near the coast, and something inside her began, slowly and painfully, to shift. The woman who had walked into the Cole mansion the night before as a bride, full of hope and certainty, was gone. In her place was someone harder, someone quieter, someone who understood now that trust could be dismantled in a single hour by a single piece of paper, and that survival would require a strength she had never before been forced to discover. She did not yet know that within a matter of weeks she would discover something that would change the shape of her new life entirely, something that would tie her forever to the very family that had just cast her out. She did not yet know that the child growing inside her, conceived in the tender weeks before the wedding, would one day become the single thread connecting two lives that fate seemed determined to keep apart. For now, she only knew the ache of betrayal, the cold weight of a night that should have been the happiest of her life, and the long, uncertain road stretching out ahead of her, toward a town she had never seen, carrying a secret she did not yet know she held. The inn gave way to open highway, and the highway gave way, eventually, to the first glimpse of the sea, gray and vast, beneath a sky heavy with clouds. Elena watched it approach with a strange, hollow calm, as if some part of her already understood that this water, this town, this new and unfamiliar horizon, would become the setting for everything that came next. Marisol reached over and squeezed her hand once, without a word, and Elena squeezed back, grateful in a way she could not yet fully express for a friend who had not asked a single unnecessary question, who had simply appeared and driven her away from the wreckage without hesitation. Behind them, in the city they had left, the Cole mansion continued its quiet, controlled disaster management. Guests were told the bride had taken ill. Staff were instructed not to speak of what they had witnessed. And Vivian Cole, satisfied with a plan executed cleanly, returned to her own quarters to prepare for the next stage of whatever larger arrangement she had been protecting since long before the wedding invitations had ever been sent. Damien remained in his study long after the guests had gone, the forged letter still resting on his desk, and though he did not yet know it, doubt had already begun its slow, quiet work in the back of his mind, a small and stubborn seed that would not fully bloom for years to come. Elena, unaware of anything happening behind her, only pressed her forehead lightly against the cool glass of the car window, and watched the sea grow closer, carrying with her a grief she understood completely, and a secret she did not yet understand at all. The town, when they finally reached it, was smaller than either of them had expected, a scattering of pale buildings along a curved harbor, fishing boats rocking gently against worn wooden docks, and narrow streets lined with shops that had clearly stood for generations. It was nothing like the polished streets of the city Elena had grown up in, and that, more than anything, was exactly why it felt safe. They found a small apartment above a bakery, the rent modest, the rooms plain but clean, and as Elena stood at the window that first evening, watching the sun sink slowly into the water, she allowed herself, finally, to cry. Not loudly, not for long, but enough to release some small portion of the grief she had been carrying since the moment Vivian Cole had placed that letter on her wedding bed. Marisol found her there an hour later, still standing at the window, her cheeks dry again, her expression settled into something resembling resolve. "I'm going to be fine," Elena said, more to herself than to her friend. "I'm going to build a life here, a real one. Whatever happens next, I will not let that family decide who I become." She did not yet know how true, and how tested, that promise would soon become. The sickness came first, sudden and unfamiliar, catching Elena off guard, on an ordinary morning 3 weeks after she and Marisol had settled into the small apartment above the bakery. She had barely finished dressing, when the smell of fresh bread rising from below sent her rushing to the small bathroom, her stomach turning violently. Marisol found her there minutes later, pale and shaking, and the look on her face told Elena that her friend already suspected what neither of them had yet spoken aloud. "You need to see a doctor," Marisol said gently, helping her to her feet. Elena nodded, though a quiet dread had already begun forming in the pit of her stomach, separate from the nausea itself. She counted the weeks in her mind, back through the wedding, back through the final tender days of her engagement to Damien, and the timing settled over her with a weight she was not prepared to carry. The clinic was small, tucked between a fishing supply shop and a shuttered pharmacy, and the doctor who examined her was an older woman, with kind eyes and an unhurried manner that Elena found oddly comforting. When the results came back, the doctor delivered the news plainly, without ceremony, the way someone might announce the weather. "You are approximately 6 weeks along," the doctor said. "Congratulations, if that is the right word for your situation." Elena sat very still on the examination table, her hands folded in her lap, absorbing a truth that changed everything about the life she had believed she was rebuilding. She was carrying Damien's child. The man who had banished her from his home, who had believed a stranger's lie over his own wife's word, was going to be a father, and he did not know it. Outside the clinic, Marisol waited on a bench overlooking the harbor, and when Elena approached, her expression must have said everything, because Marisol rose immediately, her face full of concern. "Tell me," she said. "I'm pregnant," Elena said, the words feeling strange and enormous in her mouth. "Damien's child. I'm carrying his child." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The gulls called overhead, and the boats rocked gently against the docks, and the ordinary sounds of the harbor continued exactly as they had before, indifferent to the fact that Elena's world had just shifted again, in a direction she had not anticipated. "You have to tell him," Marisol said finally, though there was hesitation in her voice, as if she already understood the complications such a decision would bring. "Tell him what?" Elena said, her voice sharper than she intended. "That the wife he threw out of his house in front of his entire family is carrying his child? He'll think I'm using the baby to force my way back into his life. Or worse, his mother will find some way to twist it, to claim the child isn't his, to protect whatever plan she was executing that night." Marisol was quiet, considering this, and Elena continued, the thoughts spilling out faster now that she had begun to give them voice. "I don't even know why she did it," Elena said. "I don't know who benefits from Damien and me being apart. But I know Vivian Cole does nothing without a reason. And if I go back now, pregnant, desperate, she will find a way to use this child against both of us. I won't let that happen." "So what will you do?" Marisol asked. Elena looked out over the water, watching a fishing boat make its slow return to the harbor, and something in her settled, quiet and certain, even as fear continued to churn beneath the surface. "I'm going to raise this child myself," she said. "Here, in this town, away from all of it. I will not let my son or daughter grow up as a piece on the Cole family's chessboard. When the time is right, if there ever is a right time, I will decide what to do. But not now. Not while everything is still so raw, so uncertain." Marisol did not argue, though Elena could see the concern still lingering in her friend's eyes. It was not an easy decision, and both of them understood the weight it carried, the years of solitary struggle it would likely demand. But Elena had already lost the life she had planned once. She was not willing to gamble what remained of her dignity on a family that had proven, in a single devastating hour, exactly how little her word meant to them. The following months passed in a strange blend of hardship and quiet determination. Elena took work at a small tailoring shop near the harbor, her skill with a needle and thread quickly earning her the respect of the shop's owner, an elderly widower named Edwin, who asked no questions about her past, and seemed content to let her work in peaceful anonymity. The pay was modest, but it was enough, combined with Marisol's steady income from her own remote design work, to keep their small apartment comfortable. As Elena's pregnancy progressed, the town itself seemed to soften around her. The baker downstairs began leaving warm bread by her door in the mornings, insisting it was simply extra from the day's batch, though Elena suspected the kindness was deliberate. The fishermen who passed her on her daily walks along the harbor began greeting her by name, and slowly, without her quite realizing it, the town that had once felt foreign and temporary began to feel, in small and unexpected ways, like home. Still, there were nights when the ache of what she had lost returned in full force, when she lay awake in the quiet apartment, one hand resting on the growing curve of her stomach, thinking of Damien, wondering if he ever thought of her, wondering if the anger he had shown that final night had softened at all, or hardened further under his mother's careful influence. She wondered too about the letter, about who had written it, about what precise combination of circumstance and motive had led to its creation. She thought of Vivian's calm, unsurprised expression, and increasingly, she began to suspect that the letter had not been born of jealousy or moral outrage, but of cold calculation, a tool designed for a purpose Elena still did not fully understand. She did not know, and could not have known, that back in the city, the coal shipping empire was quietly buckling under debts that Damien had not yet been permitted to see in full, debts that his mother had been trying, for over a year, to resolve through a merger with another powerful family, a merger that required Damien's marriage to a woman named Camille Hartley, whose father controlled a fleet of cargo vessels the Cole family desperately needed. Elena's marriage to Damien had never been part of Vivian's plan. It had been an obstacle, one she had eliminated as soon as she found the means to do so. Elena knew none of this. She only knew the fear and hope tangled together in her chest as her due date approached, the fierce and unfamiliar love already growing for a child she had not yet met, and the quiet resolve that whatever happened next, she would face it as a mother first, and as a wounded bride second. The birth, when it finally came, arrived on a stormy evening in early spring, the wind howling against the windows of the small coastal clinic as Elena labored through the long hours with Marisol at her side, gripping her hand and murmuring steady encouragement. When her son was finally placed in her arms, small and red-faced and impossibly fragile, Elena felt something inside her reorganize completely, every fear and grief reshaping itself around this new, overwhelming love. She named him Theo, a name that had no connection to either the Marsh or Cole families, a name that belonged entirely to him, untethered from the legacy of wealth and betrayal that had shaped his conception. As she held him that first night, exhausted and aching, and profoundly happy, in a way she had not expected to feel again so soon after such devastating loss, Elena made a silent promise to her son, one she intended to keep, no matter the cost. "I will protect you," she whispered, "from all of it. From the lies, from the schemes, from anyone who would ever try to use you as a piece in someone else's game. You will grow up knowing only love, Theo. That is my promise to you." Outside, the storm continued through the night, but inside the small clinic room, Elena felt, for the first time in months, something close to peace. The weeks that followed were exhausting, in the particular way that only new motherhood can be, filled with sleepless nights and the steep learning curve of caring for a newborn. But Elena found unexpected strength in the routine of it, in the simple, uncomplicated love that Theo offered her, without condition or judgment. Marisol proved an invaluable partner in those early months, taking night shifts when Elena's own exhaustion became too much, learning to soothe Theo's cries with the same patient devotion she had shown Elena since childhood. Edwin, at the tailoring shop, insisted Elena take whatever time she needed, and when she finally returned to work 3 months later, he had rearranged the small back room into a makeshift nursery, complete with a second-hand crib he had quietly purchased without telling her, brushing off her gratitude with a gruff wave of his hand. The town continued to fold Elena and her son into its rhythms, and slowly, the sharp edges of her grief began to soften into something more manageable, though never fully disappearing. She thought of Damien less often now, though he remained a constant quiet presence in the back of her mind, particularly when she looked at Theo and saw, unmistakably, his father's eyes staring back at her, along with the same slight furrow that appeared between his brows when he was concentrating deeply on something. She wondered, sometimes, watching her son grow, whether Damien would see himself in Theo's face the way she did, whether the resemblance would be undeniable, if the two of them ever crossed paths. But she pushed the thought away each time it surfaced, reminding herself of the promise she had made, the life she was building, specifically to shield her son from the very family whose blood he carried. She could not have known, as she carried Theo through his first steps and first words, through his first birthday celebrated with a small gathering of the friends she had made in the coastal town, that the careful distance she had constructed between her new life and her old one was about to be tested in ways she could not yet imagine, and that the quiet anonymity she had built so carefully was, even then, beginning to show its first small cracks. 3 years passed in the coastal town, and Theo grew from an infant into a bright, curious boy with a mop of dark hair and a habit of asking questions that left the adults around him struggling for answers. He had his mother's easy laugh and his father's sharp, watchful eyes, and though Elena often caught herself searching his small face for traces of the man she had once loved, she never allowed the resemblance to pull her back toward regret. She had built a life, modest but sturdy, and she guarded it fiercely. Edwin had grown too frail to manage the tailoring shop alone, and Elena had gradually taken over most of the daily operations, eventually becoming his full partner in every way but name. Her reputation for fine, careful work had spread beyond the small coastal town, drawing clients from nearby cities who sought out her skill for special occasions, weddings and formal events, an irony she rarely allowed herself to dwell on for too long. Marisol, meanwhile, had begun a relationship with a local fisherman named Callum, a steady, good-natured man who treated Theo with the easy affection of an uncle, and who never once made Elena feel like an obligation or a burden. Their small household had expanded into something resembling a found family, imperfect but warm, and Elena often thought that if she had been asked, 3 years earlier, whether she could rebuild happiness from the wreckage of that terrible wedding night, she would not have believed it possible. Still, she remained cautious. She used her mother's maiden name, Marsh, in every official document, and she avoided any mention of her past to new acquaintances, offering only vague references to a difficult marriage that had ended before it truly began. She read the business papers occasionally, more out of habit than genuine interest, and though she told herself she was not searching for any particular name, her eyes always paused when they passed over anything related to the coal shipping empire. What she found, in those brief and reluctant searches, painted a picture of a company under increasing strain. The merger Vivian Cole had once pursued so aggressively with the Hartley family had collapsed entirely, the details never fully explained in the papers, though rumors suggested a falling out between Damien and his mother sometime in the past year. Damien himself appeared rarely in public now, his name mentioned mostly in connection with business decisions, rather than the social columns that had once tracked his every appearance. Elena told herself these details meant nothing to her, that whatever difficulties Damien faced were no longer her concern, but some quiet, stubborn part of her heart refused to fully believe the lie. Back in the city, Damien's life had indeed changed dramatically since the night he banished his bride. The guilt had come slowly at first, a nagging discomfort he told himself would fade with time, but it had instead grown steadily heavier as the months passed, feeding on small inconsistencies he could not fully ignore. The letter, when he finally forced himself to examine it closely, nearly a year after the wedding, showed signs of hasty forgery that his own trained eye, accustomed to reviewing shipping contracts and legal documents daily, should have caught immediately, had his judgment not been so thoroughly clouded by his mother's carefully timed presentation. He confronted Vivian about it 18 months after the wedding, in a conversation that ended with both of them shouting words neither could take back. Vivian did not deny the forgery outright, but she refused to explain her reasoning, insisting only that she had acted in the family's best interest, that Elena's family connections had never been sufficient to justify the marriage, and that the Hartley merger, had it succeeded, would have secured the company's future for another generation. The merger, however, had already collapsed by then, the Hartley family choosing instead to align with a rival shipping company after growing frustrated with the delays and complications Vivian's scheming had introduced. The sacrifice of Elena's marriage, it turned out, had accomplished nothing beyond destroying 2 lives and driving a permanent wedge between mother and son. Damien had not spoken to his mother in any meaningful way since that confrontation. He had taken over full control of the company's daily operations, pushing Vivian into a largely ceremonial role, and though the business itself had stabilized under his more careful leadership, something essential in him remained broken, unresolved, and restless. He had hired investigators twice to search for Elena, both attempts ending in failure. She had vanished too completely, too deliberately, leaving no trace for anyone determined to find her, and Damien had eventually stopped trying, though the absence of an answer did nothing to ease the guilt that had settled permanently into his chest. He did not remarry, despite his mother's continued, increasingly desperate attempts to arrange another advantageous match. Damien refused every introduction, every carefully orchestrated dinner, every hint dropped by well-meaning associates about eligible young women from respectable families. He told himself, in his more honest moments, that he was waiting for something he could not fully name, an opportunity to make right what he had so carelessly broken, though he had no idea how such an opportunity might ever arise. His days settled into a rigid, joyless routine of meetings and negotiations, his evenings spent alone in the same mansion where he had once ordered his bride out into the night. He had considered selling the estate more than once, unable to pass the bridal suite without a wave of shame washing over him, but something always stopped him, some stubborn refusal to erase the physical space where his greatest mistake had occurred, as if keeping it intact were a form of penance. His closest friend and legal advisor, a sharp, plain-spoken man named Nathan Voss, had watched this slow unraveling with growing concern, and it was Nathan who finally convinced Damien, nearly 3 years after the wedding, to attend a charity gala hosted by the Cole Foundation, in a small coastal town the company had recently begun investing in through a new fishing and shipping partnership. "You've been a ghost in your own life for 3 years," Nathan told him bluntly, over drinks in Damien's study. "Get out of this house. Show your face. The foundation needs you there, and frankly, so do you." Damien resisted at first, citing the demands of ongoing negotiations, but Nathan pressed harder than usual, and eventually, more out of exhaustion than genuine agreement, Damien relented. He told himself the trip would be brief, a single evening of obligatory smiling and handshaking, followed by a swift return to the isolation he had grown accustomed to. He did not know, could not have known, that the coastal town chosen for the gala was the very same town where Elena had built her quiet new life, where his son had taken his first steps, spoken his first words, and grown into a bright, curious boy who bore an unmistakable resemblance to the father he had never met. The days leading up to the gala passed uneventfully in Elena's world, though a persistent unease had settled over her without clear explanation, the kind of quiet dread that sometimes precedes change before any concrete evidence justifies it. Edwin had mentioned, in passing, that a large company from the city was investing heavily in the local harbor, funding improvements to the docks, and hosting some sort of charity event at the town hall, and Elena had listened with only mild interest, her attention more focused on Theo's upcoming birthday celebration than any distant corporate gathering. Marisol had been asked, through her design work, to help coordinate some of the event's decorations, and she mentioned it to Elena over dinner one evening, describing the modest but elegant plans for the gala with the easy enthusiasm of someone looking forward to a pleasant evening out. "You should come," Marisol said. "It's been ages since you've done anything beyond work and Theo's school schedule. Callum can watch him for a few hours." Elena hesitated, her natural caution rising instinctively at the mention of any event connected to a large city company, though she could not have named the source of her unease even if pressed. But Marisol's persistence, combined with her own quiet longing for a rare evening of adult conversation and normalcy, eventually won out, and Elena agreed, telling herself there was no reason to expect anything beyond a pleasant, uneventful gathering. She did not yet know the name of the company hosting the event. She did not yet know that fate, after 3 years of careful avoidance, was about to place her directly in the path of the man she had spent so long trying to forget, and that the careful, protective world she had built for herself and her son was about to be tested in ways far beyond anything she had prepared for. The town hall had been transformed for the evening, its usual plain interior softened by strings of warm lights and tables draped in pale linen, the modest venue doing its best imitation of the grand ballrooms Damien was accustomed to attending in the city. He arrived late, as he often did now, slipping into the gathering with the quiet, guarded reserve that had become his default expression over the past 3 years, nodding politely to the local officials and foundation representatives who greeted him at the entrance. Nathan stayed close beside him, steering him through the necessary introductions with practiced efficiency, and for the first hour, the evening unfolded exactly as Damien had expected, a predictable rotation of handshakes and small talk that required little genuine engagement from him. Elena arrived nearly an hour after the event began, having spent longer than intended settling Theo into bed under Callum's watchful care, and she entered the hall feeling slightly out of place, in the simple but elegant dress Marisol had insisted she borrow for the occasion. She scanned the room briefly for her friend, spotting Marisol near the refreshment tables, deep in conversation with another guest, and began making her way across the crowded floor. It was the sound of his laugh that stopped her first, a low, familiar sound she had not heard in 3 years but recognized instantly, some deep and stubborn part of her memory refusing to have forgotten it despite everything that had happened since. She turned toward the sound almost against her own will, her eyes finding him across the room before her mind had fully processed what she was seeing. Damien stood near the far wall, taller than she remembered, his features sharper, more tired, but unmistakably his own. For a long, suspended moment, Elena could not move, could not breathe. Every carefully constructed wall she had built over the past 3 years, threatening to collapse in an instant at the simple, devastating sight of him, standing less than 50 feet away. He had not yet seen her. He was still engaged in conversation with someone from the Foundation, his attention focused elsewhere, and Elena understood, with sudden and urgent clarity, that she needed to leave immediately, before he turned, before their eyes met, before the fragile life she had built for herself and Theo was thrown into chaos by a single accidental glance. She began moving toward the exit, weaving quickly through the crowd, but fate, or perhaps simple bad timing, intervened before she could reach the door. Marisol, unaware of the crisis unfolding, called out her name across the room, loud enough to draw the attention of several nearby guests, and Elena froze mid-step, her name still echoing faintly through the hall. Damien turned toward the sound, his gaze sweeping automatically across the crowd, and then stopped, completely and utterly, on the familiar face he had spent 3 years failing to forget. The conversation around him faded into meaningless noise as he stared across the room at Elena, standing frozen near the exit, her expression a mixture of panic and something else, something that looked almost like grief. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The distance between them felt both impossibly small and impossibly vast, 3 years of separation compressed into the space of a crowded room, and Elena watched as recognition, disbelief, and something raw and unguarded moved across Damien's face in rapid succession. He began walking toward her before he had consciously decided to do so, his earlier conversation abandoned mid-sentence, and Elena, realizing escape was no longer possible, forced herself to remain still, to meet his approach with whatever composure she could manage. "Elena," he said, stopping a few feet away from her, his voice rough with an emotion he seemed unable to fully contain. "You're here." "I didn't know it was your event," she said, her own voice steadier than she felt. "I would not have come." The words landed harder than she intended, and she watched something flicker across his face, a flash of pain quickly masked by the careful composure he had learned to maintain over years of business negotiations. "I've looked for you," he said quietly, stepping closer despite the clear tension in her posture. "For years, Elena, I hired investigators. I searched everywhere I could think of." "Why?" she asked, and the question carried more weight than a single word should have been able to hold. "You made your feelings very clear the night you sent me away." Damien flinched, visibly, at the memory, and for a moment, he seemed unable to find the words to respond. Around them, the party continued, oblivious to the quiet crisis unfolding near the exit, though Marisol had noticed by now, watching from across the room with growing alarm, uncertain whether to intervene. "I was wrong," Damien said finally, the words seeming to cost him considerable effort. "The letter was forged. My mother arranged the entire thing to force an end to our marriage, so she could pursue a merger with another family. I discovered the truth too late, and by then, you had already disappeared." Elena absorbed this information with a strange, hollow calm, the confirmation of a suspicion she had carried for years, arriving without the satisfaction she might have once expected. Knowing the truth did not undo the pain of that night, did not return the years she had spent rebuilding her life from nothing, did not erase the fear and exhaustion of raising a child entirely alone. "That doesn't change what happened," she said. "You didn't ask a single question that night, Damien. You didn't give me the chance to explain, to defend myself. You simply believed the worst and threw me out like I meant nothing to you." "I know," he said, and the raw regret in his voice was unmistakable. "I have thought about that night every single day since it happened. I know an apology cannot undo what I did, but I am asking for the chance to make it right, however that might be possible." Elena studied his face, searching for any trace of the manipulation she had learned to fear from his family, but found only genuine, exhausted sincerity, the expression of a man who had clearly carried his guilt as a constant, unwelcome companion for years. Still, sincerity alone could not repair what had been broken, and Elena was acutely aware of the much larger truth she had not yet revealed, the truth that would change this conversation entirely the moment it was spoken. Before she could decide how, or whether, to proceed, a small, familiar voice called out from across the room, cutting through the tension with the innocent urgency only a young child could produce. "Mama!" Elena's stomach dropped as she turned to see Theo running toward her, having apparently talked Callum into bringing him to find her after growing restless at home, Callum trailing a few steps behind, with an apologetic expression already forming on his face. Theo reached her side and wrapped his arms around her legs, and Elena's hand instinctively moved to rest on his dark hair, her mind racing through the impossible calculations of the moment unfolding in front of her. Damien's eyes moved slowly from Elena's face down to the small boy pressed against her side, and Elena watched, with a mixture of dread and strange relief, as recognition began to dawn across his features, his gaze taking in the dark hair, the familiar set of the boy's jaw, and finally, unmistakably, his own eyes staring back up at him, from a face far too young to have developed such deliberate, careful watchfulness on its own. "Elena," Damien said slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "How old is he?" Elena closed her eyes briefly, feeling the last of her careful control slip away entirely. There was no more hiding, no more careful distance to maintain. The truth she had guarded for 3 years stood plainly visible in the small, curious face looking up at both of them, waiting for an explanation neither adult seemed ready to provide. "He's 3, Elena said quietly. "His name is Theo." The silence that followed stretched long enough for the noise of the party to fade entirely from Elena's awareness, the entire world narrowing down to the small space between herself, Damien, and the son whose existence had just been revealed, in the middle of a crowded charity gala, in precisely the manner Elena had spent 3 years trying desperately to avoid. Damien knelt slowly, bringing himself to eye level with the boy, his expression a mixture of wonder and devastation that Elena had never seen on him before, not even on the terrible night he had banished her from his home. "Hello, Theo," he said softly, his voice unsteady. "My name is Damien." Theo studied him with the frank, unguarded curiosity of a young child, tilting his head slightly. "You have the same eyes as me," he said matter-of-factly, and Elena watched Damien's composure crack entirely, his hand rising unconsciously to cover his mouth, as the full weight of the moment settled over him. "Yes," Damien said, his voice barely audible. "I think we do." The gala continued around them, but for Elena, Damien, and Theo, the noise and music had become distant and unimportant, background static to a moment that demanded far more attention than any of the surrounding guests could have understood. Marisol appeared quickly at Elena's side, sensing the crisis, and gently suggesting they move somewhere quieter, away from curious eyes that had already begun to notice the unusual scene unfolding near the entrance. They found a small side room, normally used for storing folding chairs and event supplies, and the 4 of them, Elena, Damien, Marisol, and Callum, stood in tense, uncertain silence, while Theo, oblivious to the weight of the moment, wandered toward a stack of chairs and began climbing them, with cheerful determination. "I need to know everything," Damien said, his voice low and controlled, though Elena could see the effort it took him to maintain that control. "Why didn't you tell me? 3 years. Elena, I have a son I never knew existed." "I found out I was pregnant after you sent me away," Elena said, matching his tone with careful steadiness of her own. "I was alone, humiliated, and terrified. I did not know if the letter was your mother's doing or your own decision. I did not know if telling you would bring me back into a family that had just destroyed me, or if it would simply give your mother another weapon to use against me." "You could have trusted me," Damien said, though the words came out less as an accusation and more as a quiet, painful admission of his own failure. "Trust you?" Elena repeated, and for the first time since he had approached her, real anger surfaced in her voice. "You didn't trust me, Damien. You believed a stranger's forged letter over 2 years of knowing me. I had no reason to believe that telling you about our child would result in anything other than more heartbreak, more manipulation from your mother, more danger for a baby who had done nothing wrong except exist." Damien absorbed this in silence, his jaw tight, his eyes moving briefly toward Theo, who had abandoned the chairs and was now examining a stack of folded tablecloths with the same intense focus Elena recognized from Damien's own expression during difficult business negotiations. "I understand why you didn't trust me then," Damien said finally. "I gave you every reason not to. But I am asking you to consider trusting me now. I am not the same man who threw you out of that house. I have spent 3 years trying to become someone worthy of correcting that mistake, even without knowing whether I would ever have the chance." Elena studied him carefully, weighing his words against the memory of that devastating night, against the years of solitary struggle that had followed, against the fierce protectiveness she felt toward the life she had built for her son. She did not doubt his sincerity in this moment, but sincerity had proven unreliable before, and she was no longer willing to gamble her son's well-being on promises alone. "I need time," she said finally. "This is not a decision I can make standing in a storage room at a charity gala. I need to think about what is best for Theo, and I need assurances that your mother will not become involved in whatever happens next." "I will handle my mother," Damien said, and there was a new hardness in his voice, a determination Elena had not heard from him before. "She has caused enough damage. She will not be permitted anywhere near my son, unless I am absolutely certain it is safe." The word son seemed to catch in his throat as he said it, as if the reality of it was still settling into place, still too new and enormous to fully comprehend. He looked again at Theo, who had returned to his mother's side and was now studying Damien with the same open curiosity as before. "Can I see him again?" Damien asked, his voice softer now, almost pleading. "Not to disrupt your life, not to force anything, just to know him, to be present, in whatever way you're willing to allow." Elena hesitated, torn between the protective instincts that had guided her for 3 years, and the quiet, undeniable truth that Theo deserved the chance to know his father, provided that relationship could be built safely, away from the schemes that had poisoned everything before. "We can talk," she said finally. "Tomorrow. Not tonight. I need time to process all of this, and I want Marisol with me when we speak, and I want it far away from any possibility of your mother's involvement." Damien nodded immediately, grateful for even this small, cautious opening. "Wherever and whenever you're comfortable," he said. "I will not push you, Elena. I have taken enough from you already." They arranged to meet the following afternoon at a quiet cafe near the harbor, away from the town hall and any lingering gala guests who might recognize either of them. Elena left that night with Theo asleep in her arms, Marisol driving them home in careful silence, both of them processing the enormous shift that had just occurred in their carefully constructed world. "Do you trust him?" Marisol asked eventually, as the harbor lights faded behind them. "I don't know," Elena admitted. "Part of me wants to believe he's changed. But I built this life to protect Theo from exactly this kind of uncertainty, and now it's standing right in front of us, and I don't know how to keep him safe, while also giving him the chance to know his father." "You'll figure it out," Marisol said. "You always do." Back at the gala, Damien remained in the storage room long after Elena had left, staring at the stack of tablecloths Theo had been examining moments before, trying to absorb the full weight of what had just happened. Nathan found him there eventually, drawn by whispered rumors already circulating through the remaining guests about the emotional scene near the entrance. "What happened?" Nathan asked, closing the door behind him. Damien looked up at his old friend, his composure finally breaking entirely, 3 years of carefully controlled grief and guilt spilling out in a single, unsteady breath. "I have a son," he said. "Elena has been raising our son alone for 3 years, and I never knew." Nathan absorbed this with visible shock, quickly followed by a hardening resolve that Damien recognized from years of watching his friend navigate difficult legal battles. "Your mother needs to be told nothing," Nathan said firmly. "Not yet. Not until you and Elena have figured out how to protect that child from whatever she might try to do with this information." "She'll find out eventually," Damien said. "She always does. Then we make sure that by the time she finds out, there's nothing left for her to manipulate," Nathan said. "You need to move carefully here, Damien, for Elena's sake, and for your son's." Damien nodded slowly, the exhaustion of the evening settling heavily over him, mixed with an emotion he had not felt in years, something dangerously close to hope. He thought of Theo's small, serious face, the careful way he had studied Damien's eyes, and noted their resemblance with such matter-of-fact certainty, and something in Damien's chest ached with a longing he had not fully understood he was carrying until that exact moment. He returned to the city late that night, his mind consumed entirely by thoughts of the family he had just discovered he possessed, and the delicate, uncertain path that now stretched ahead of him, one that would require every bit of patience and restraint he could summon if he hoped to rebuild what his own carelessness and his mother's manipulation had so thoroughly destroyed 3 years earlier. He did not sleep that night. Instead, he sat in his study, staring at a small, worn photograph he had kept hidden in his desk drawer since the wedding, a candid image of Elena laughing at some long-forgotten joke, taken during the early, happy months of their courtship. He studied her face for a long time, searching for the boy's features within it, and found them easily, the same warmth in the eyes, the same stubborn set of the jaw. Somewhere in the coastal town, Elena lay awake as well, Theo sleeping soundly beside her, and stared at the ceiling of her small bedroom, wondering whether the fragile peace she had built for her son was about to be tested beyond anything she had prepared for, and whether opening even the smallest door back into Damien's world would ultimately protect her son, or place him in greater danger than she could currently imagine. The cafe near the harbor was quiet in the early afternoon, most of its tables empty except for a handful of local fishermen finishing late lunches, and Elena chose a corner table facing the door, a small, practical habit she had developed over the past 3 years, always aware of her surroundings, always prepared to leave quickly if necessary. Marisol sat beside her, arms crossed, her expression carefully neutral, but her eyes sharp with protective attention. Damien arrived precisely on time, dressed more casually than Elena had seen him the previous evening, though the effort at simplicity did little to disguise the careful, deliberate way he moved through the world, a habit built from years of navigating boardrooms and negotiations. He sat across from Elena, glancing briefly at Marisol with a polite nod, before returning his full attention to Elena. "Thank you for agreeing to see me," he said. "I'm not here to make this easy for you," Elena said, her tone measured but firm. "I'm here because Theo deserves the chance to know his father, if that can happen safely. Everything else is secondary to that." Damien nodded, accepting the terms without argument. "I understand. Whatever you need me to do, whatever boundaries you need me to respect, I will follow them. I am not asking to undo the past 3 years. I am asking for a chance to be part of whatever comes next." They spent the following hour discussing practical matters, carefully and deliberately avoiding the deeper emotional wounds that still lingered beneath the surface of their conversation. Damien proposed a slow, gradual introduction, brief supervised visits that would allow Theo to grow comfortable with him, without any sudden disruption to the stable life Elena had built. He offered financial support, which Elena firmly declined, insisting that she had managed without his family's money for 3 years, and had no intention of accepting it now, though she agreed, after some negotiation, to allow him to contribute toward Theo's future education. "I don't want Theo confused about who provides for him," Elena said. "I built this life myself. I want him to understand that stability comes from consistency, not from money appearing suddenly because his father has finally decided to acknowledge him." Damien accepted this without argument, though Elena could see the words had stung slightly, a reminder of exactly how much he had failed to provide during the years he had unknowingly missed. "Understood," he said quietly. "I'll follow your lead on all of it." Over the following weeks, a careful, cautious rhythm began to establish itself. Damien traveled to the coastal town every other weekend, staying at a small inn near the harbor, rather than imposing on Elena's household, and spending several supervised hours each visit getting to know his son. Theo, with the easy adaptability of young children, accepted this new presence in his life with remarkable openness, quickly developing an enthusiastic fondness for the quiet, attentive man who seemed endlessly interested in every detail of his small world. Elena watched these visits with a complicated mixture of relief and lingering wariness, noting the genuine patience Damien showed, the careful way he never pushed for more access or involvement than she was willing to grant, the obvious effort he put into learning Theo's preferences and habits. Slowly, despite her deep reservations, something in her guarded heart began, cautiously, to soften. Marisol noticed the shift before Elena fully acknowledged it herself. "You watch him differently now," she observed one evening, after Damien had left following another weekend visit. "Like you're starting to believe him." "I don't know if I believe him," Elena said carefully. "But I believe he loves Theo. That much seems undeniable." "And you?" Marisol asked gently. "Do you still have feelings for him?" Elena did not answer immediately, staring instead at the small drawing Theo had made that afternoon, a simple crayon sketch of 3 figures standing together beneath a bright yellow sun, labeled in careful, uneven letters as Mama, Papa, and Theo. She had found it tucked into her sewing basket that evening, apparently left there deliberately by her son, and the sight of it had unsettled her more than she was willing to admit. "It doesn't matter what I feel," Elena said finally. "What matters is protecting Theo, and making sure whatever happens between his parents doesn't put him in danger." But even as she said the words, she understood their incompleteness, understood that the careful walls she had built around her heart were beginning to show cracks she had not anticipated, cracks that both frightened and, in some small, stubborn way, offered a fragile kind of hope she had believed herself incapable of feeling again. Back in the city, however, the careful peace Damien had been building was about to face its first serious threat. Vivian Cole, though largely sidelined from the company's operations, still maintained an extensive network of informants throughout the family's social circles, and it did not take long for whispers of Damien's frequent, unexplained trips to a small coastal town to reach her attention. She summoned Nathan to her private residence under the pretense of discussing an unrelated business matter, and through careful, probing questions, extracted enough information to confirm her growing suspicions. When Nathan finally admitted the truth, that Damien had discovered a son, a grandson Vivian had never known existed, her reaction was not the outrage Nathan had expected, but something far more calculating. "A male heir," she said slowly, almost to herself, her mind already working through the implications. "That changes things considerably. Damien wants this handled quietly," Nathan warned her. "He does not want you involved, Vivian, not after everything that happened." "I am still his mother," Vivian said sharply. "And that boy, whether Damien likes it or not, is still a Cole. I have every right to be part of his life." Nathan left the meeting deeply uneasy, immediately calling Damien to warn him of his mother's discovery, but the warning arrived too late to prevent what came next. Within days, Vivian had hired her own investigators to gather detailed information about Elena's life in the coastal town. And armed with this knowledge, she began quietly formulating a plan that would allow her to reassert control over a situation she viewed as dangerously outside her influence. She understood, with the same cold calculation that had guided her forgery of the letter 3 years earlier, that Damien's guilt and affection for Elena and Theo represented a significant vulnerability, one that could, with careful manipulation, be turned to her own advantage. She began, quietly and methodically, laying the groundwork for a legal challenge, consulting with her longtime family lawyer, a sharp and ruthless man named Gerald Finch, about the possibility of establishing formal custody rights over Theo as the Cole family's rightful heir, rights that could, if successfully pursued, place the boy's future firmly under her control rather than Elena's. Damien, unaware of the full scope of his mother's scheming, continued his careful, patient visits to the coastal town, believing the fragile peace he had built with Elena remained secure. He did not yet know that his mother had already begun assembling the pieces of a plan designed to tear that peace apart entirely, using the very love he had only recently discovered as the weapon through which she intended to regain control. The letter arrived on a quiet Tuesday morning, delivered by courier to the tailoring shop where Elena worked, and the moment she saw the official seal of a prominent city law firm stamped across the envelope, a familiar dread settled deep in her stomach. Edwin, noticing her sudden pallor, offered to close the shop for the afternoon, but Elena waved him off, needing the distraction of routine work, while she gathered the courage to open what she already suspected would be devastating news. Inside, formal legal language outlined a petition filed by Vivian Cole seeking a custody evaluation regarding Theo, citing concerns about the boy's welfare, given what the document described as Elena's unstable and undocumented living situation, and her history of concealing the child's paternity from his legitimate family. The letter demanded Elena's presence at a preliminary hearing in the city within 3 weeks, along with a formal request for a psychological evaluation to determine Elena's fitness as a sole custodial parent. Elena's hands shook as she read the document a second time, then a third, disbelief giving way to a rising, furious panic. Vivian Cole, the woman who had orchestrated the destruction of her marriage through outright forgery, was now attempting to use the very concealment that destruction had necessitated as evidence against her fitness as a mother. She called Marisol immediately, her voice barely steady enough to explain the situation, and within the hour, both women sat at Elena's kitchen table, the legal document spread between them, Theo napping peacefully in the next room, unaware of the storm gathering around him. "She can't actually take him from you," Marisol said, though her voice carried more hope than certainty. "You're his mother. You've raised him alone for 3 years without any support from that family." "That's exactly what worries me," Elena said, staring at the document with growing dread. "She's not trying to prove Damien is unfit. She's trying to prove I am, and if she has enough money and enough lawyers, she might actually succeed, regardless of what's true." Elena called Damien that evening, her voice tight with barely controlled fear, and read him the contents of the letter while he listened in stunned, furious silence on the other end of the line. "This ends now," Damien said, his voice hard, in a way Elena had never heard from him before. "I will handle this personally. She will not touch Theo, Elena. I promise you that." "Your promises haven't exactly held up before," Elena said, the words escaping before she could soften them. 3 years of hard-won caution, refusing to be easily set aside, despite the genuine care Damien had shown in recent months. "I know," Damien said quietly, absorbing the accusation without defense. "But this time, I have something to lose, that I understand completely. I am not going to let my mother destroy this family a second time. He arrived at the coastal town the following morning, forgoing his usual measured, scheduled visits in favor of an immediate, urgent appearance, and the two of them, along with Nathan, who had driven separately to provide legal counsel, spent the entire day strategizing a response to Vivian's petition. "We need evidence," Nathan explained, spreading papers across Elena's small kitchen table. Evidence of the forged letter, evidence of Vivian's motive in fabricating it, and clear documentation of the stable, loving environment Theo has grown up in here. If we can demonstrate a clear pattern of manipulation on Vivian's part, the court will have serious doubts about her credibility and her true intentions. "Do we have proof of the forgery?" Elena asked. "You said Damien discovered it 18 months ago. Is there something concrete? Something that would hold up legally?" Nathan hesitated slightly before answering. "We have Damien's testimony regarding the inconsistencies he noticed, and we have circumstantial evidence connecting the forged letter's timing to the collapsed Hartley merger. But we don't currently have direct proof that Vivian herself created the letter, only strong circumstantial suspicion." Elena felt her stomach sink further. Without direct proof, the case could easily devolve into a battle of competing narratives, wealthy family versus struggling single mother, a fight in which Vivian's resources and influence could prove decisive regardless of the underlying truth. "There has to be something," Elena said. "She's too careful to have left nothing behind, but someone that confident, that certain of her own power, might have also been careless in ways she doesn't realize." Over the following days, Nathan's investigators worked quickly, interviewing household staff who had been present at the Cole mansion around the time of the wedding, several of whom, now free from the fear of retaliation that had silenced them years earlier, proved willing to share what they remembered. One former housekeeper, a woman named Grace Bellwether who had left the Cole family's employment shortly after the wedding, under circumstances she described as deeply uncomfortable, agreed to provide a sworn statement describing overhearing a conversation between Vivian and an unfamiliar man in the weeks before the wedding, a conversation that included explicit discussion of creating proof that would end the marriage before it could interfere with the Hartley negotiations. The statement alone was not conclusive proof, but combined with financial records Nathan managed to obtain, showing a substantial payment from Vivian's personal accounts to an individual specializing in forensic document forgery around the same period, the pieces began forming a clear, damning picture. "This is enough," Nathan said, reviewing the assembled evidence late one evening, "not just to defend against her custody petition, but potentially enough to expose her actions to the entire board and family, ending her influence over this family permanently." Damien, who had remained largely silent during the evidence-gathering process, absorbing each new revelation with visible, controlled fury, finally spoke. "I want to confront her directly," he said, "not just defeat her petition quietly through legal maneuvering. I want the entire family, the entire board, to understand exactly what she did, and why. She destroyed 3 years of my life, and Elena's, and Theo's, for a merger that failed anyway. She does not get to walk away from that without consequences." Elena watched him as he spoke, seeing genuine, righteous anger replace the guilt and hesitation that had characterized him since their reunion at the gala, and something in her chest, some final reservation she had been holding on to, began, cautiously, to release its grip. "If you do this," Elena said carefully, "there's no going back. Your relationship with your mother, whatever remains of it, will likely be permanently damaged." "It already is," Damien said simply. "It has been since the night I sent you away and finally understood what she had cost us. I'm not protecting a relationship that still exists, Elena. I'm protecting the family I actually have left." The plan they formed over the following days was careful and deliberate, designed not just to defend against Vivian's custody petition, but to publicly expose the full extent of her manipulation before the very board members and family associates whose respect and support had allowed her to maintain influence over the company for so long. It would require confronting Vivian directly, in a setting where her usual tactics of private manipulation and careful control would be rendered powerless by the presence of witnesses who could not be silenced or dismissed. Elena, despite her exhaustion and lingering fear, felt something new settling alongside the anxiety, a fierce, protective determination that matched Damien's own. She had spent 3 years hiding, protecting her son through careful distance and anonymity. Now, faced with a direct threat to everything she had built, she found herself ready, for the first time, to fight openly, for the life she and Theo deserved, rather than continuing to retreat from danger. "When do we do this?" she asked. "The board meeting is in 10 days, Damien said. "She'll be there, along with every major shareholder and family member, with a stake in the company's future. If we're going to end her influence permanently, that's where it needs to happen." Elena nodded slowly, gathering her resolve. "Then that's when we do it." 2 days before the scheduled board meeting, Elena received a call from Theo's school that sent ice through her veins. The school secretary explained, in a careful, professional tone, that a woman claiming to be Theo's grandmother had arrived at the front office that afternoon, requesting to pick him up early, and presenting what appeared to be legal documentation, asserting a right to do so. The staff, following proper protocol, had refused to release Theo without Elena's explicit authorization, but the woman had lingered outside the school gates for nearly 20 minutes afterward, before finally leaving. Elena's hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the phone steady as she thanked the secretary and immediately called Marisol, then Damien, her voice tight with barely controlled panic as she relayed what had happened. "She tried to take him from school," Elena said, pacing frantically across her small living room, while Theo, thankfully oblivious, played nearby with a set of wooden blocks Callum had carved for him. "Damien, she tried to take our son." "I'm coming now," Damien said, his voice equally sharp with fury and fear. "Do not let him out of your sight. I'll call Nathan immediately, and have him file for an emergency protective order, preventing any contact from my mother until the custody matter is resolved." The following hours passed in a blur of tense phone calls and hurried legal filings, Nathan working through the night to secure a temporary court order, barring Vivian from any direct contact with Theo, while Damien drove through the darkness toward the coastal town, arriving just before dawn, exhausted but resolute. He found Elena still awake, sitting on the small couch with Theo curled asleep against her side, having refused to put him to bed alone, even after the danger had passed, needing the physical reassurance of her son's presence close beside her. "I'm sorry," Damien said quietly, sitting carefully on the edge of the couch, careful not to wake Theo. "I should have anticipated she would do something like this. I underestimated how far she would go." "You didn't underestimate her," Elena said, her voice hollow with exhaustion. "None of us did. We knew she was capable of anything. We just hoped there would be time to stop her before she acted." "There's a protective order in place now," Damien said. "She legally cannot approach Theo, or you, without facing immediate consequences. Nathan secured it an hour ago." Elena nodded, though the reassurance did little to ease the fear still coursing through her. She had spent 3 years successfully protecting her son from exactly this kind of danger, only to have it materialize the moment his existence became known, confirming every fear that had kept her silent and hidden for so long. "I want this over," she said. "I want her stopped completely, not just held back temporarily by a piece of paper she'll find some way around eventually." "She will be stopped," Damien said firmly, "at the board meeting. Completely and permanently, I promise you that." Elena looked at him carefully, searching his exhausted, determined face for any hint of the wavering uncertainty that had characterized him on their wedding night, and found none. Something in him had hardened into unshakable resolve, and for the first time since their reunion, Elena allowed herself to fully believe that he intended to follow through on every promise he had made since discovering Theo's existence. The remaining days before the board meeting passed under heightened security, Damien arranging for discreet protection around Elena's apartment and Theo's school, though he was careful to keep the presence unobtrusive, unwilling to disrupt his son's sense of normalcy any further than circumstances already demanded. Marisol and Callum took turns staying close to the apartment during the day, and Elena found herself grateful, in a way she had rarely allowed herself to feel before, for the found family that had gathered around her and Theo over the past 3 years. Vivian, meanwhile, having failed in her attempt to remove Theo directly, shifted her strategy toward the upcoming board meeting itself, working with Gerald Finch to prepare her own presentation, one designed to paint Elena as an unstable, opportunistic woman who had concealed a child for financial gain, timing her reappearance in Damien's life to coincide suspiciously with the company's recent financial recovery. She remained confident, even after the failed attempt at the school, that her decades of carefully cultivated relationships with board members and shareholders would ultimately outweigh whatever evidence Damien and Elena had managed to assemble. She had survived challenges to her authority before, and she saw no reason to believe this situation would prove any different, despite the mounting evidence steadily working against her. Nathan spent the final days before the meeting meticulously organizing every piece of evidence they had gathered: the forged letter, the housekeeper's sworn testimony, the financial records documenting the payment to the forgery specialist, and the timeline connecting all of it directly to the collapsed Hartley merger. He prepared Damien carefully for the presentation, anticipating every possible objection or counterattack Vivian and her lawyer might attempt. "This has to be flawless," Nathan warned. "She will fight back hard, and she has spent decades learning exactly how to manipulate that boardroom." "We cannot afford a single misstep," Damien nodded, absorbing the preparation with grim determination, though his thoughts kept drifting, in quiet moments, back to Elena and Theo in the coastal town, to the fragile, precious family he had only recently discovered and was now fighting desperately to protect. He thought of the terror in Elena's voice when she called to tell him about the school, the exhausted fear on her face when he arrived that morning, and something in him hardened further, a fierce, protective resolve that eclipsed even his earlier guilt. The night before the board meeting, Damien called Elena, needing to hear her voice, needing the reassurance of connection before facing the confrontation ahead. "Are you ready?" she asked. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I know I have to do this, regardless of whether I feel ready. For you, for Theo, for the family I should have protected 3 years ago and failed to." "You're protecting it now," Elena said quietly. "That's what matters." There was a long pause on the line, comfortable despite the tension of the coming day, and finally Elena spoke again, her voice softer, more vulnerable than Damien had heard since their reunion. "Come back safely," she said. "Both of us, all 3 of us. We need you to come back from this." "I will," Damien promised, and for the first time since the terrible night that had torn their lives apart, he felt something close to complete certainty settle over him, a clarity of purpose that steadied his nerves for the confrontation waiting for him the following morning. The boardroom on the 40th floor of the coal shipping headquarters filled steadily that morning, shareholders and family members taking their seats around the long polished table, while quiet conversation hummed through the room, most attendees unaware that anything beyond routine quarterly business was scheduled for discussion. Vivian arrived early, composed and elegant as always, taking her customary seat near the head of the table, with Gerald Finch positioned discreetly nearby, ready to support whatever narrative she intended to present. Damien entered last, deliberately, Nathan at his side carrying a thick folder of documents, and Elena, who had insisted on being present despite Damien's initial concerns about exposing her to such a hostile environment, walked in just behind them, her spine straight, her expression carefully composed, despite the nervous energy coursing through her. Marisol had offered to watch Theo for the day, and Elena had left the coastal town before dawn, determined to face this confrontation directly, rather than waiting anxiously for news from a distance. A ripple of surprised murmurs moved through the room, as Elena took a seat near the back, several longtime family associates recognizing her despite the years that had passed since the wedding, whispered questions passing quickly between them. Vivian's composed expression flickered, just briefly, at the sight of Elena's unexpected presence, though she recovered quickly, her face settling back into practiced calm. Damien called the meeting to order once the standard quarterly business had concluded, and rather than allowing the meeting to proceed toward adjournment, he remained standing, drawing the attention of the assembled board members with the deliberate authority he had cultivated over 3 years of running the company largely alone. "Before we close today's meeting," Damien said, his voice steady and clear, carrying easily through the large room, "there is a matter of significant importance to this family and this company that I need to address directly, in front of all of you." Vivian's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, though she maintained her composure, folding her hands calmly on the table in front of her. 3 years ago," Damien continued, "on the night of my wedding to Elena Marsh, I was presented with a letter alleging her infidelity. Based on that letter, and without proper investigation, I banished my wife from this family, ending our marriage in disgrace before it had truly begun." Murmurs spread quickly through the room, several board members exchanging startled glances, clearly unaware of the full details behind the long-rumored dissolution of Damien's marriage. "That letter," Damien said, his eyes moving deliberately to meet his mother's steady gaze, "was forged, manufactured specifically, to end my marriage and clear the way for a merger with the Hartley shipping family. A merger my mother had been pursuing for over a year, one she believed my marriage to Elena was standing in the way of." "This is a serious accusation, Damien," Vivian said calmly, her voice carrying just enough warning to suggest the conversation should end there. "One I hope you have substantial evidence to support before making it in front of this entire board." "I do," Damien said, and nodded to Nathan, who began distributing carefully organized copies of the evidence to each board member seated around the table. "Sworn testimony from a former household employee who overheard my mother discussing the creation of false evidence weeks before my wedding. Financial records documenting a substantial payment from my mother's personal accounts to an individual specializing in forensic document forgery, made just days before that letter appeared, and a clear timeline connecting the forgery directly to the collapse of my marriage and the subsequent, ultimately failed, pursuit of the Hartley merger." The room fell into stunned silence as board members began reviewing the documents in front of them, several exchanging increasingly troubled glances as the evidence painted an unmistakably damning picture. Vivian's composed expression finally began to crack, a flush of anger rising in her cheeks as she realized the extent of the case Damien and Nathan had assembled against her. "Everything I did," Vivian said, her voice sharpening with barely controlled fury, "I did to protect this company, to protect this family's future. That merger would have secured our position for a generation." "The merger collapsed anyway," Damien said, his voice hard and unyielding. "Everything you destroyed, my marriage, 3 years of my life, 3 years Elena spent raising our son alone, without any support, accomplished nothing beyond causing devastating, unnecessary pain." A fresh wave of shocked murmurs moved through the room at the mention of a son, several board members turning to look directly at Elena, who met their gazes with quiet, steady dignity, refusing to look away despite the intense scrutiny. "You have a grandson," Damien said, turning back to face his mother directly. "A grandson you attempted to remove from his mother's care through legal manipulation, and when that failed, through an unauthorized attempt to take him from his school just days ago. An attempt that violated a protective order, specifically established to prevent exactly that kind of action." Vivian's face had gone pale now, the full scope of the situation clearly settling over her, as she realized the extent of the case being laid out before the very people whose continued respect and support had allowed her influence within the company to persist for so long. "I did what I believed was necessary," Vivian said, though her voice had lost much of its earlier confidence. "This family has survived on strategic decisions for generations. I made one such decision, and I do not apologize for prioritizing this company's future." "You prioritized your own control," Damien said. "Not the company's future, not this family's well-being, your own influence, your own power, regardless of the human cost required to maintain it." He turned to address the assembled board members directly, his voice carrying the full weight of 3 years of accumulated grief and determination. "I am asking this board to formally remove my mother from any remaining position of influence within this company, effective immediately, and I am asking that this evidence be forwarded to appropriate legal authorities for further investigation into the forgery and its consequences." The room remained silent for a long, tense moment before one of the senior board members, a longtime family friend named Percival Ashworth, who had known Damien since childhood, finally spoke, his voice grave and measured. "The evidence presented today is deeply troubling," he said. "I move that we proceed with Damien's requested action regarding Vivian Cole's removal, pending further review of the documented evidence." The motion passed with overwhelming support, only 2 board members abstaining, and Vivian sat in stunned, furious silence as her decades of carefully constructed influence collapsed within the span of a single meeting, exposed and dismantled by the very evidence of her own manipulation. She rose from her seat eventually, her composure returning in brittle, defensive fragments as she gathered herself to leave the room, pausing briefly beside Damien's chair. "You will regret this," she said quietly, though the threat carried little of its usual weight, diminished entirely by the public exposure she had just endured. "Family should protect family, Damien, not destroy it in front of strangers." "You destroyed this family first," Damien said, his voice quiet but absolutely unwavering. "I am simply making sure you can never do it again." Vivian left the boardroom without another word, Gerald Finch trailing uncertainly behind her, and the assembled board members slowly began returning to their own business, the shock of the morning's revelations settling into quiet, murmured conversation throughout the room. Elena remained seated near the back, watching the scene with a strange, hollow relief. The confrontation she had feared for weeks finally concluded, the threat that had loomed over her and Theo finally, decisively neutralized. Damien crossed the room to her side once the meeting had fully dispersed, his expression exhausted but unmistakably lighter than she had seen it since their reunion. "It's done," he said quietly. "She has no more power to threaten you or Theo. Legally, professionally, she is finished within this company, and the evidence will likely result in additional legal consequences beyond that." Elena nodded slowly, feeling the tension that had gripped her for weeks finally begin, cautiously, to release. "Thank you," she said, "for choosing us, for choosing the truth, even knowing what it would cost you with your mother." "I lost my mother the night I chose to believe her lie over your word," Damien said quietly. "Today, I simply made peace with a loss that already happened 3 years ago. What I gained today, what I refuse to lose again, is you and Theo." Elena studied his face carefully, searching for any remaining trace of doubt or hesitation, and found only quiet, steady certainty. Something in her chest, some final wall she had maintained since the terrible night of the wedding, finally, completely released, and for the first time in 3 years, Elena allowed herself to imagine a future, built not on careful protection and distance, but on genuine, hard-won trust. 6 months passed following the board meeting that ended Vivian's influence over the Cole family business, and in that time, the careful, tentative trust between Elena and Damien had grown steadily into something neither of them had expected to feel again after the devastation of that first wedding night. Damien had relocated much of his work to allow for longer, more frequent stays in the coastal town, gradually easing his way into the rhythms of Elena and Theo's established life, rather than attempting to pull them abruptly into his own. He had rented a small house near the harbor, close enough to Elena's apartment that Theo could visit easily, but respectfully separate, understanding that rebuilding trust required patience and consistent, demonstrated reliability rather than grand gestures or rushed decisions. He attended every school event Theo participated in, learned the names of his son's friends and teachers, and slowly became a fixture in the town's daily life. The fishermen and shopkeepers, who had once known him only as a distant, powerful businessman, gradually coming to know him simply as Theo's father, present, and involved in ways few had expected from someone of his position. Elena watched this transformation with cautious, growing wonder, the fierce protectiveness that had guided her for 3 years, gradually softening, as Damien consistently proved, through countless small, patient actions, that the man who had banished her on their wedding night had genuinely, fundamentally changed. She did not forget the pain of that night, could not simply erase 3 years of solitary struggle and hard-won independence, but she found herself, increasingly, allowing space for something beyond mere caution, something that felt, cautiously and unexpectedly, like renewed hope. Vivian, following her removal from the board, had retreated entirely from public life, facing ongoing legal consequences related to the forgery and the subsequent unauthorized attempt to remove Theo from his school. Damien maintained no contact with her, though he ensured, through Nathan, that she retained sufficient resources for a comfortable, private life, unwilling to extend the same cruelty toward her that she had once shown Elena, even as he refused to allow her any continued influence over his family's future. The tailoring shop had grown steadily under Elena's careful management, Edwin eventually stepping back entirely into a comfortable, well-earned retirement, and formally transferring ownership to Elena, who expanded the shop's offerings, while maintaining the same careful, personal attention to each client that had first earned her the town's respect and affection years earlier. She had built something entirely her own, something no forged letter or family scheme could ever take from her, and the pride she felt in that accomplishment remained, even as her life expanded once again to include Damien. On a warm evening in early autumn, nearly a year after their unexpected reunion at the charity gala, Damien invited Elena to walk with him along the harbor after Theo had been settled for the night under Marisol and Callum's watchful care. The evening air carried the familiar scent of salt and fresh bread from the bakery below Elena's apartment, and the two of them walked in comfortable, easy silence along the worn wooden docks, watching the last fishing boats return for the day. "I've been thinking," Damien said eventually, stopping near the end of the dock where the harbor opened into the wider sea beyond, "about everything that's happened since that gala, about how close I came to never finding my way back to you and Theo at all." "But you did find your way back," Elena said quietly. "That's what matters now." "I don't want to simply have found my way back," Damien said, turning to face her directly, his expression carrying the same careful, unguarded sincerity she had come to recognize over the past year. "I want to build something permanent, something that can never again be threatened by lies or manipulation or fear. I know I have no right to ask this of you, not after everything I put you through, but I am asking anyway, because I cannot imagine my future without you and Theo at the center of it." He knelt slowly on the worn wooden planks of the dock, producing a small, simple ring from his pocket, nothing like the elaborate jewelry that had marked their first, disastrous wedding, but something quieter, more personal, chosen specifically for the woman she had become, rather than the bride he had once nearly destroyed. "Elena Marsh," he said, "will you marry me again? Not to restore what was lost, but to build something entirely new. Something built on truth and trust, rather than family expectation and hidden schemes." Elena stood very still for a long moment, looking down at the man kneeling before her, thinking of everything they had survived together and separately, the pain and betrayal, the fierce independence she had built from nothing, the fragile, hard-won trust that had grown steadily between them over the past year. She thought of Theo, asleep in his bed just a short walk away, of the drawing he had made months earlier depicting the three of them together, beneath a bright yellow sun, and she felt, finally and completely, the last of her guarded hesitation dissolve into quiet, certain joy. "Yes," she said, her voice steady and clear, despite the tears gathering in her eyes. "Yes, Damien, I will marry you again." Their second wedding, held the following spring, bore no resemblance to the grand, elaborate ceremony that had ended so disastrously 3 years earlier. It took place instead on the beach near the harbor, small and intimate, attended only by the people who had genuinely earned a place in their rebuilt lives: Marisol and Callum, Edwin, Nathan, and the local friends and neighbors who had welcomed Elena and Theo into their community during the difficult years of quiet rebuilding. Theo, now 4 years old and full of solemn importance regarding his role in the ceremony, carried the simple rings down the sandy aisle, with careful, determined focus, beaming with pride when he successfully delivered them without mishap. Elena wore a simple, elegant dress she had designed and sewn herself, and as she walked toward Damien, along the sun-warmed sand, she felt none of the uncertain hope that had marked her first wedding, replaced instead by a deep, settled certainty, earned through years of hardship and careful, patient rebuilding. As the ceremony concluded, and Damien lifted Theo onto his shoulders amid the small, joyful crowd of well-wishers, Elena looked out over the sea that had witnessed so much of her quiet, private struggle, the same water that had greeted her 3 years earlier as a devastated, banished bride, and felt, for the first time since that terrible wedding night, completely and thoroughly at peace. The secret she had carried alone for so long, the fear and grief and fierce protective love that had shaped every difficult decision along the way, had finally, fully resolved into something she had once believed impossible to reclaim. A family built not on hidden schemes or forced arrangements, but on hard-earned truth, patient forgiveness, and love that had proven, ultimately, stronger than the lies that had once nearly destroyed it entirely.